So, really quickly, I just wanted to talk a bit about the survivalist and corruptionist debate within the Thomistic school of philosophy. This debate is about the nature of the human person after the death of the composite substance, whether it continues to exist or not. So, both camps hold that the soul continues to exist after the death of the body, but the survivalists hold that the human person also continues to exist with the soul, whereas the corruptionist position is that the individual, the person, the supposite, ceases to exist, although the soul continues to exist. Now, I used to be a pretty staunch corruptionist, but now I kind of reversed my position. I'm a pretty staunch survivalist. And the reason for this mostly it has to do with the supposite nature distinction. But before I go into that, we have to look at the actual being in question. So the being in question that we are discussing is going to be the human being. And the human being is essentially a mobile being. It is a changing being. It is a material being. And so there are certain principles which go along with being that kind of thing, namely the intrinsic principles, matter and form. So matter is the determinable substratum that stands in potency to the reception of substantial form, which is the determinate act which makes the being the kind of thing it is. Now, matter serves as the principle of potency and form as the principle of act in this case, because form in itself is universal, and whatever is potential receives and limits what is actual to be in some finite mode. So, this is exactly what happens when matter individuates form, because form in itself, since it is universal, when it is limited by matter, it is limited to a particular dimensive quantity, and it is limited to particular functions which depend entirely on that particular determinate quantity. So as matter restricts form to a determinate quantity in place and time, whatnot, matter serves as the principle of potency in the substance, and form as the principle of act. Now, as form determines matter to exist, form as a principle of act, it has to have the existential power to do such a thing. Now, the formal cause, insofar as it has its existential power, receives it from the efficient cause, which is the act of existence. So the act of existence is mediated to the substance through the form, by which the form actuates the matter to form an existing composite substance. And it is the composite substance, or the supposite, which is said to actually properly bear the existence. It's not that the form exists and the matter exists. It is properly said that the substance exists, and that the form and matter exist in the substance. Now, given that in generally immaterial substances, the form of a material substance is a material form. It is a form in matter and a form from matter, both in its place of being and its place of origin. So that kind of form is entirely exhausted by its existence in forming matter. So if the matter ceases to be, if the matter is separated from that form also ceases to be. But if form and matter are the constituent principles of the existence of a supposite, of an individual, then if the matter and form are separated, and then neither exist by themselves, then the supposite or the substance is substantially corrupted and is nothing. It ceases to exist. This is the kind of picture that the corruptionist wants to paint for the human substance. That since death is a substantial change, and that involves the separation of the matter and form, then given that the matter and form separate, then that, just like all other material substances, that's going to involve the cessation of the supposite's existence. Although the form, as it is subsistent, continues to exist beyond the death, the separation of the form from its matter will corrupt the substance, and so there will not be an existing person. There will not be an existing supposite, an individual. But this just goes back to the supposite nature distinction. So the supposite nature distinction is the distinction in a thing between its individual nature and its supposition, its individuality, its being an individual. So there must be a real distinction between supposite and nature in a substance, because if there were no real distinction between supposite and nature in human beings, let's say, then every human being would be the same. There couldn't be multiple individuals that share the same nature. There would just be one individual. All individuals would be the same individual, which is obviously absurd. We are individual humans that share a common nature. So if there is to be an individual nature, the human nature of Jacob, the human nature of John, the human nature of Jane, these individual natures are going to be really distinct from the supposit. Now, although supposit and nature are really distinct, they are only inadequately distinct, or I believe the more analytic term is a minor real distinction, whereas they are really distinct, but they're inseparable. You can't have an existing nature without a supposit, because in order to exist, there must be some sort of subsistence. Whereas substances subsist in themselves, whereas accidents subsist in substances. Material substances have matter as an essential constituent of their being, material substances subsist in their matter. And so anything that exists either subsists in itself or subsists in another. Now, nature in itself is not subsistent. It is supposit that adds subsistence to nature. Remember that nature exists in the supposit, because nature consists of form and matter, or just in the case of angels, form. But either way, form and matter, they exist in the supposit as co-constituent principles. So nature exists in the supposit. So there is no such thing as an existing nature without there being some sort of supposit which supposits for the nature and gives it subsistence. Even in the case of God, where there is no real distinction between nature and supposit, it's not that God is a nature without supposit. It's not that God is just nature and there is no supposit. The lack of a real distinction between supposit and nature in God does not mean that there is no supposit in God. It just means that in God, supposit and nature are not really distinct. Now, again, what is form? Form is a part of nature. So if there is going to be an existing form, which is what the corruptionist wants to hold, the corruptionist wants to hold that the form of the human being exists beyond the death of the composite substance. Well, if the soul is subsistent, and it is because it is immaterial, it's wholly immaterial and incorporeal, if the soul exists beyond the death of the composite substance, and the soul is the form of the body, and form is a part of nature, then you have an existing nature, even if the nature is incomplete. Right? The nature lacks the matter because the soul is separated from the matter. But the corruptionist will still concede that you have an incomplete existing nature. But if you have an existing nature, there must needs be a supposit which supposits for that nature, because supposit and nature are inseparable, because supposit adds subsistence to the nature, and nature exists in the supposit as its term. And so given that what a person is just, it's an individual substance of a rational nature, and individual substance, as Aquinas calls it, is a hypostasis, which is a supposit. If you have an existing form, if you have an existing nature, then you have the supposit, which has that act of existence, and thus gives that subsistence to nature, because nature exists in that supposit as its term. So it doesn't matter if you have an incomplete nature. It doesn't matter if the matter is separated from the form. If the form is subsistent and can exist beyond any existence of matter, then the self-same supposit, which supposited for the soul while the matter existed, it remains the same. Now, I think a major mistake that corruptionists make in this regard is that they just they entirely collapse substance and supposit. They use substance and supposit in entirely convertible terms. So they'll say that a human being or a human substance is essentially essentially a composite of matter and form. It is essentially a material substance, and so if you don't have something that's material, then you just don't have a human substance, and so the substance doesn't exist, but the supposit is just the substance. So if the substance doesn't exist, then the supposit doesn't exist. I know Dr. Christopher Tomaszewski seems to use supposit and substance interchangeably in this manner, but the issue is that it's not as easy to say. It's not that easy to just say that, well, there is corruption of the substance, therefore the supposit ceases to exist. First of all, because we know as Catholics, well, not all Thomists are Catholics, but I'm just going to take that for granted. As Catholics, and as good Orthodox Trinitarians, we know that there are three persons in God, but we don't say that there are three substances in God. The terms person and substance, and person as being an intellectual supposit. Therefore, supposit and substance are not necessarily interchangeable in every sense. Some will point to the definition of supposit to argue against this. They say that supposit is a subsisting individual complete substance. It is a subsisting individual complete substance. But a substance which has an incomplete nature is not a complete substance. And therefore, there can't be a supposit, because a supposit is a complete substance. You can say there's an incomplete substance, but you cannot say there is a supposit, because a supposit is a complete substance. But this just simply misuses or misunderstands what it is for a supposit to be complete. For a supposit to be complete does not require that its nature be complete, because the supposit and nature are really distinct. The completeness of the supposit is not going to be referenced to the thing which is really distinct from it. It's not going to be referenced to the completeness of the thing which is really distinct from it, the nature. The completeness of the supposit just consists in the lack of communicability that an incomplete substance would have, such as form's natural communicability to matter. And that completeness is entirely satisfied in the case of an incomplete nature. There's nothing incoherent about there being a complete supposit with an incomplete nature. Now, one thing that the survivalist would really want to avoid is saying that the death of the whole human material substance is merely an accidental change. The survivalist will still want to maintain that the death of the body is a substantial change. But then the corruptionist could say, well, look, if you're saying that the supposit survives with an incomplete nature, and the supposit is a subsisting individual complete substance, then there is no change in substance. The substantiality remains the same, so there is no substantial corruption. But if there is no substantial corruption, then the separation of matter and form, the death of the body, must be an accidental change. And of course, there's a lot of problems that would involve. Ed Feser has an article on this sort of debate, and he really seems to sort of endorse a survivalist position in which the death of the body would be something like an accidental change. And I think Christopher Tomaszewski does some good work on explaining why that would be really, really bad. But it's a good thing that this objection actually fails. It will be weird to say this at first, or it'll be weird to hear this at first, but let me explain. The lack of corruption of the substantiality does not entail that there cannot be a substantial corruption. So let me say that again. The fact that the substantiality does not corrupt does not mean that there is not a substantial corruption. Now, the reason, or the reasons, first of all, is because the corruption is in virtue of something happening in the nature, right? The matter separating from the form, there is an incomplete nature here. So the corruption is in virtue of the nature, not of the substantiality of the supposit. Now, the nature is the essence, and so this corruption of essence, it can't be something accidental. It cannot be classified as an accidental corruption, because what is essential is prior to what is accidental. It is not what is accidental, and of course, substance does not just refer to supposit, because supposit is first substance. There is also second substance. The genus of substance is larger than that of supposit. And so essence is entirely capable of being included in the genus of substance, specifically under the understanding of substance as ousia, the Greek ousia. Clearly, the corruption of the nature, thus resulting in the incompleteness of the nature, it has to consist, or it has to be considered substantial corruption. So there is substantial corruption on the survivalist view. So the substance, we can really say that the substance corrupts. There is a substantial corruption. There is no more human being. The human being does not exist because the human being is essentially material, and something material does not exist anymore. There is real substantial corruption. But it is not because that the substantiality is corrupted. It is because there is some sort of corruption in the nature resulting from that incompleteness of the nature, in virtue of the separation of the matter and form. So overall, I really think the survivalist has the edge in the metaphysics. I really think that the metaphysics themselves just lends itself towards this position. I don't really care if Aquinas himself was a survivalist or a corruptionist. I don't really care about that exegetical debate. And so, in conclusion, the two major points where I think this debate hinges on is the acknowledgement of the supposite nature distinction and how that plays a role in this. And that kind of calls me to think of Christopher Tomaszewski again, who kind of in a video he said that the definition of person is not really relevant to the debate, even though I think it's entirely relevant, because if you're going to talk about whether the person survives post mortem, you have to define what person is. You can't talk about something you don't know what the definition is, and so the person is a supposit, and so if a person is a supposit, you're going to have to bring up the nature or the distinction between nature and supposit in this debate. So firstly, the supposit nature distinction is going to have to be recognized. That's very important. Secondly, understanding that substance and supposit are not entirely interchangeable, because supposit is first substance. It is an individual in the genus of substance. And also understanding that for a substance to be complete does not necessitate that it is complete in its nature, because there is a distinction between completeness in nature or species and completeness in substantiality. Whereas an incompleteness in both can result in substantial corruption. And I think that's pretty much it. I don't want to go into the certain critiques of the corruptionist position, or like the negative consequences of the corruptionist position. I just wanted to go over the straight metaphysics and just explain why I think the straight up metaphysics just points directly to the survivalist position, and I just wanted to point out some mistakes that the corruptionists I think make. So if you're watching and you have any sort of input on this debate, the survivalist corruptionist debate, if you're a Thomist, if you're a budding Thomist, if you just have any questions about this or just any comments at all, leave a comment down below. Please like, please subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.